the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. I'm your host, Allison Nissen, and today I am lucky enough to have with me Elizabeth Randall. Elizabeth, why don't you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Allison. I really appreciate it. I am kind of eclectic in what I write. I was a high school English teacher and freelance writer for many years. And then in 2011, I got a job where I had to float from room to room as a teacher. So my first published book was called The Floating Teacher. And it was kind of a handbook because I couldn't find any literature on it. So I wrote a book about it. And it was published by Maupin House, which has since gone out of business. So the book's out of print. But after that, I wrote a book called Haunted St. Augustine and St. Johns County, which I think that was published in 2011. And it's still pretty popular, published with History Press. And it's about all, St. Augustine, all of the, haunted places. But in my book, I tried to put information in there that wasn't general knowledge, information that you couldn't get from the ghost tours, and a very heavy emphasis on history, the history of St. Augustine, because I'm a big history buff. As an English teacher, I had to teach history along with the literature. And then my next book, which I think is my most popular, my next book is Women in White, The Haunting of Northeast Florida, which was published with Schiffer Publishing. And this was about Duval County, Nassau County, Clay County, and Nassau County, and very strong on history, but coupled with ghost lore. And then my next book, which was really my most popular and still is, was called Murder in St. Augustine, The Mysterious Death of Athalia Ponsell Lindsley. And this is a true crime book about a murder that occurred in 1974 in St. Augustine that is still very, very important to longtime residents. And this book kind of solves the mystery of who killed Athalia. And then my last book, which was published about a year ago, also with History Press, is called The Ocklawaha River Odyssey. And this is the book that I won the gold for with the recent Royal Palm Literary Awards.
So you are a recent 2020 award-winning author. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
You do a lot of research on historical facts and then present them to your audience. How do you do your research?
I love research, and I have no real formal training in it other than the fact that my father and my grandfather were journalists. My grandfather was the dean of city police reporters for the New York Daily Mirror, and my dad wrote the in-house newsletter for IBM for most of his career. So just that's my training in research and journalism. But I think the first thing I really researched was a story I wrote back in 2006 about a murder that occurred in Deltona. It was called the Xbox Murders. And I got to interview the lead suspect and wrote, a story for Orlando Weekly about it. And I went through every single deposition, every court transcript. I interviewed everyone I could find connected with the case. So when I started writing books, I kind of knew, how to cut out the work. I'd make a list of everyone associated with it, and I would interview them. For the Murder in St. Augustine book, I went through 1,000 pages of depositions and transcripts and police reports and records. And I spend a lot of time in museums because like the Amelia Island Museum of History and the St. Augustine Historical Society have tons of information. And there's so many obscure little facts you can root out and even mysteries you can solve. So I just spend a lot of time reading everything I can get my hands on, having to do with the subject. And it's worked out pretty well because all of my books, I think, are very unique in that they offer perspectives you really couldn't find in the, just in most other books.
Ferret out those small little details. You mentioned that they are obscure. How do you actually, be like, aha, perfect detail to add?
Oh, well, when I find something that is not in any of the literature I've read before, but it's a true fact. I write mostly nonfiction. I'm trying to write fiction, which I find very difficult. I'm friends with Laura Lee Smith, who wrote The Ice House and Heart of Palm, and she thinks nonfiction is hard, but I don't. Well, to give you an example, in Murder in St. Augustine, when you try to draw out the characters of real people, it helps, to come across these little obscure details. For instance, in this book, Murder in St. Augustine, the suspect, the city manager of St. Augustine, was harassing the murder victim in the days prior to her demise. And she suspected that he had poured sugar into the gas tank of her car. And her husband came home and asked Alan Stanford, the murderer suspect, and he climbed up on his roof and said, pretended he had to do some work, which told me that he was really a coward. So that was kind of something I incorporated. And then during the trial, he tried to portray the victim as nuts and insane. And he used examples that were, very dated because she had challenged, the men on the county commission. And that just wasn't done in those days. So my whole point with that book was that she was born too soon and she kind of died because she was an outspoken woman who challenged the status quo. And, I found research to support my supposition.
That is really interesting information. I like that you are actively looking for those little nuances. They're hard to find, and when you find them, they probably feel like they fit that puzzle piece perfectly. Developing characters can be such a challenge. So you're taking this historical true people,
Non-fiction.
And you're not even really fictionalizing them. You're just building out their personality.
Yeah, I look for that kind of thing. I look for the characterization in history because, history is so interesting. You can interpret it so many different ways. And I can't, say I try to be objective. I can't guarantee I'm totally objective, but everything I write is grounded in fact.
And of course, facts can be not altered. Facts can be adjusted to fit a narrative.
Which I hope I don't do. I have a friend who's like, well, if I fudge a little here or fudge a little there, no one's going to find out. And I'm like, I don't do that because with my background in journalism, I got burned when I was young, and if I didn't fact check everything explicitly, it would come back to bite me. So I'm very careful with that. But, you can draw your own conclusions. So.
And then bringing the characters to life. So I love details about characters and how we are able to breathe life into them. It's one of my favorite things to do and to read on the page. So you take these historical facts, you build the framework around what they would have been doing, how they would have been acting. For example, the person on the roof who might have been a little bit of a coward. And then you can add those little small details that would, maybe if someone were afraid of heights, how they would act if they were up on a roof, if they were afraid.
Right, right. And Athalia Ponzel Lindsley, the subject of my book, Murder in St. Augustine, she was the most interesting thing. There are many interesting things about her murder, horrible and interesting, but she was vilified by the community. She was dead, and the guy who was on trial for her murder was a very well-liked, prominent member of St. Augustine Society. And people said terrible things about her, like she deserved it, and she had it coming, and her murder is technically never solved. But I wanted to portray her a different way, the way that she would be portrayed if the murder, had occurred in the 21st century. And if you look at it from that perspective, the vilification of her character was just horrifying, because, she was killed with a machete and people had no sympathy for her whatsoever, So part of it, was where she lived and so forth. But I was very interested in exonerating her from her own murder, so to speak, because I didn't feel she deserved it. I thought she was awesome.
Tell me about the ghost stories.
Okay, well, my first actually, I wrote the ghost stories as one big book, but I couldn't sell it that way. So I had to divide it up into two books for two different publishers, because History Press only publishes regional information. And the most stories I had were about St. Augustine. And then Women in White is a compilation of many other stories. And the most interesting thing about both books, but particularly Women in White, is the systemized racism. This is the South, but the systemized racism that runs through all the stories. For instance, one of the houses in Fernandina Beach, the Williams house, which is now a bed and breakfast, was actually a safe house for runaway slaves. And the owner of the house, Mr. Williams, came from a deeply Southern family. And he's still supposed to, be in the house, sitting in the chair in his little engineer hat and smoking his pipe. But I found letters in the Amelia Island Historical Society from his relatives in the 70s saying, oh, we weren't too proud of him, because he, was helping slaves run away and that kind of thing. And then the most interesting story, ghost story, was about a place called Franklintown Cemetery. I don't know if most people are aware, but in the 60s and 70s, cemeteries of slaves and their descendants were pretty much plowed over. It was common to put a road through a Black community and kind of disseminate it, and their cemeteries would just be paved over, even though that's really not even legal. But Franklintown is a cemetery right inside a very expensive housing community called Plantation Point. And the caretaker of it is a descendant of slaves, a man named Mr. Green, who went away to fight in the Vietnam War. And when he came back, his town was gone. One of his ancestors, Morris Drummond, used to hear a voice in the woods that he and his sister would follow. And he'd get in trouble for leaving the house because his mom had to work in the fields all day. And so, but he kept hearing this voice, and it was very compelling. And finally, his uncle said, just next time you hear that voice, just laugh at it and it'll go away. And that's what he did. And he's buried in the Franklintown Cemetery too. But Mr. Green, the caretaker of the cemetery inside this expensive housing development, is very good friends with all the neighbors with their screened-in pools, and they kind of look out for the cemetery for him to make sure that no one, in his words, messes with it. But it was very interesting, to see how social change has accelerated and decreased. And these stories, I think, help bring awareness, not only of ghosts, but of some of the conditions that people dealt with in those days.
What's the most valuable advice you've ever received as a writer?
Oh, that's easy. When I was a teacher, I'm retired. When I was a teacher, I used to have people from the Sentinel come in to talk to my writing class. We had Daryl Owens and we had Jeff Kunith. And we would talk privately a lot about writing. And Jeff said to me, look, I said, it's so hard to write when I'm teaching full time. I'm exhausted. I don't have time. I had a teenager in the house at the time. And he said, look, get up an hour early every morning and just write for an hour every day. Make a commitment to do that. And then some other good, which I've done ever since then. And then some other good advice. Stephen King wrote one of the best books I've ever read on writing. You're nodding. Have you read it? Okay. And he said, don't set a time to write, set a number of pages, because as writers, we all know we can sit down, we can do a crossword puzzle, we can file our nails, we can check out our email, and 2 hours go by and you haven't written a word. So I have taken Stephen King's advice and I make sure I write a certain amount of pages every day, and that helps a lot.
That is very good advice. Elizabeth, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, I have a Facebook page. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a Twitter handle, and I also have an author page on Amazon.
And is that all Elizabeth Randall, or is there
Elizabeth Randall? You should. I don't know. It's a very common name, but I think I'm not sure how many other, there are some other Elizabeth Randalls on Amazon, but I still think you can pretty easily find me, especially if you put one of the titles of my books in there.
All right. Well, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
I'm really scared, but go ahead, Allison.
They're not quite as scary as a ghost story.
That's true.
Where do you not mind waiting?
Well, I voted this morning and I waited in line for an hour and I did not mind a bit because I was so geared up. So let's say voting lines, I'm good.
Excellent, excellent. If you could have one room in your house added on, so one addition to your house, what would it be for?
Books.
Books, an extra library.
I'd like to take you through my house. I have huge bookshelves. I own 1,200 books and adding all the time. I'm not proud of that. I try to recycle them. I send books to prisoners as much as I can because I know they need books. It helps. But I just never have enough room for books. I have shelves of them. I have the stacks. So maybe a wing for another library.
Third question. What is your favorite breakfast item?
Oh, that's easy too. A chocolate covered donut from Dunkin' Donuts with a vanilla latte. That just goes right to your head. Then of course you sing, but
I love how specific it is. That's awesome. That is amazing. Yes. So it sounds like quite a great way to start your day.
Well, you're ready for a nap by noon, but it is a great way to start. So I don't do it every day.
They weren't very scary questions.
All right. No, they were good. So thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you for stopping by.
Thank you so much, Allison. It was my pleasure.
Everyone, you have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Allison Nissen. Allison out.
Elizabeth Randall is an English high school teacher in Central Florida. She was a floating teacher for 2 years and during that time accumulated the knowledge and experience to write her first book. She has since become a historic author and is also a freelance writer, most recently an RPLA winner. For more information about Elizabeth Randall, visit her at her website, hauntedfloridahistory.com. For more information about the Florida Writers Association, visit us on the web at floridawriters.org.